World War I didn't truly begin with the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand. That single act of violence, a 19-year-old nationalist pulling a trigger on a Sarajevo street, was a spark, not the fire. The gunshot was a symptom. The disease had been festering for decades. The true causes ran through the heart of 19th century Europe. Empires were cracking under their own weight. The Austro-Hungarian Empire was a patchwork of ethnicities bound by bureaucracy and fear. The Ottoman Empire, once vast, had been dubbed the sick man of Europe. Even the mighty British and French empires were struggling to hold together colonies increasingly restless under foreign rule. Meanwhile, Germany, newly unified and rapidly industrializing, wanted a seat at the imperial table. It had power, but not yet position. And that made it dangerous. Across the continent, nationalism surged. It wasn't just pride in country. It was the belief that your people had a destiny, and others stood in the way. In the Balkans, Slavs dreamed of independence from Austria. In Germany and Italy, the call for national greatness became fused with militarism and myth. Old aristocracies clung to power as modern forces, socialism, suffrage, mass politics, gathered strength. There was a sense, especially among Europe's elites, that war might not be a disaster, but a cleansing force, a way to reassert control. Then came the alliances. What began as diplomatic agreements became shackles. The Triple Alliance, Germany, Austria-Hungary, and Italy, stood opposed to the Triple Entente, France, Russia, and Britain. What was meant to preserve peace actually ensured that a war between any two countries would become a war between all of them. And behind it all was an arms race. Industrial power had made war more mechanized, more deadly, more impersonal. Machine guns, railways, battleships. The tools were ready, and the war plans were drawn. No one wanted to be caught off guard. Everyone expected to strike first. So when Gavrilo Princip pulled the trigger in June 1914, the world was already a dry field waiting for fire. Austria moved against Serbia. Russia mobilized to defend it. Germany declared war on Russia. France joined. Britain followed. The system didn't fail. It worked exactly as designed and dragged the world into chaos. The myth is that World War I began in a moment. The truth is that it had been waiting for one. And once it began, there was no turning back. When the war ended in 1918, the world gasped for peace. 4 years of mechanized slaughter had shattered an entire generation. Empires had fallen. Cities had crumbled. Millions were dead and millions more wounded in body and mind. The armistice was signed not with triumph, but with exhaustion. The guns fell silent, but not because anything was resolved. At Versailles in 1919, the victors gathered to shape the post-war world. But what emerged wasn't a vision of reconciliation. It was a blueprint for revenge. Germany was declared guilty for the war and burdened with impossible reparations. Its military was gutted. Its borders were redrawn. Its colonies were stripped away. Humiliation was baked into the settlement, not just economically, but symbolically. The treaty wasn't just a document, it was a wound. Across Central and Eastern Europe, the collapse of the Austro-Hungarian and Ottoman empires left behind a chaotic patchwork of new nations: Poland, Czechoslovakia, Yugoslavia, Hungary, Turkey. Some carved by ethnic lines, others by imperial whim. None truly stable. Ethnic minorities found themselves as strangers in new countries overnight. Borders didn't reflect identity. They reflected compromising convenience. Tension simmered beneath the surface, unresolved and often unacknowledged. Meanwhile, the Russian Empire had imploded during the war. The Bolshevik Revolution swept away the old order. But what replaced it was not peace. it was civil war. The Red Terror, the White Resistance, foreign intervention, famine. Russia was out of the Versailles equation, but its chaos would ripple across the century. Even among the victors, peace bred discontent. Italy, promised territorial gains, felt betrayed when they didn't fully materialize, a grievance that would fester into fascism. Japan, though on the winning side, was denied full recognition as a global power, a slight it would not forget. And the Arab world, promised independence in return for rising up against the Ottomans, was instead carved into mandates and protectorates, controlled by Britain and France. The League of Nations, designed to prevent future war, was born weak. The United States, whose president had proposed it, refused to join. Without enforcement power, without legitimacy, it became a hollow gesture, a hope without teeth. So, while the world celebrated the end of the Great War, what it had actually done was create a volatile new order built on resentment, inequality, and denial. The war was over, but nothing was settled. Germany smoldered under economic collapse and national disgrace. New nations tottered on shaky foundations. Old powers tried to hold on to colonial empires that were already slipping away. This was not the peace to end all wars. It was a pause, a bitter, unstable intermission. The stage was set, the players were in place, and the next act would be even more brutal. World War II was not a separate event. It was the unfinished sentence of the war that never truly ended. It picked up where the first left off, not just in time, but in cause. The grievances of Versailles had not faded. They had festered. In Germany, national pride had been shattered, and the economy collapsed under the weight of reparations, hyperinflation, and a global depression. Democracy arrived in the Weimar Republic, but it was weak, fragile, and burdened with the impossible task of governing a humiliated people. In that void stepped a man who offered certainty, strength, and revenge. Adolf Hitler didn't rise despite Versailles. He rose because of it. He promised to undo the past and restore a mythic future. He blamed enemies within and without, and he found a willing audience. Across the globe, the economic chaos of the Great Depression had shattered faith in liberal democracy. Where democracy faltered, authoritarianism thrived. Italy, under Mussolini, had already embraced fascism, a toxic blend of nationalism, militarism, and spectacle. Spain descended into civil war. And in Japan, a militarized state pursued empire through invasion, first in Manchuria, then China. Japan needed resources, markets, and legitimacy, and it intended to take them. Fascism didn't just rise in response to hardship. It rose from the ashes of disappointed empire. Germany had lost its colonies. Italy had gained little. Japan had been denied recognition. These fascist regimes promised to reclaim greatness, to redraw the map, to reassert dominance in a world they believed had betrayed them. And so, the world began to burn again. Germany annexed Austria and carved up Czechoslovakia. Japan marched through East Asia with brutal efficiency. Italy invaded Ethiopia. The democracies, weary from the last war and paralyzed by the trauma of appeasement, hesitated, then buckled. By the time Hitler invaded Poland in 1939, the momentum for another global conflict was unstoppable. The scale of the destruction that followed shattered every previous notion of war. Nations were reduced to rubble. Entire populations were exterminated. The Holocaust, the firebombings of cities, the nuclear devastation of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Civilian and soldier alike were caught in a war that was total, not just of weapons, but of ideologies, economies, and cultures. When the dust settled in 1945, as many as 80 million people were dead. Empires that had ruled continents collapsed under the weight of exhaustion and defeat. the world began to change forever. And yet, from all that loss, for all that total victory, the world did not find peace. The Axis powers were defeated, but the rivalries that drove them never truly died. The victors themselves emerged divided. A new conflict, colder but no less dangerous, was already beginning. What had begun in 1914 as a war between empires had become something much larger, a century-defining fracture of the global order. World War II wasn't a new story. It was the second act of a tragedy still unfolding. After 1945, the world did not heal. It split, not along national lines, but ideological ones. Two superpowers emerged from the ashes of World War II, each claiming to represent the future of civilization. The United States championed liberal democracy, free markets, and capitalism. The Soviet Union stood for state socialism, planned economies, and one-party rule. The battle was no longer over territory alone. It was a struggle for the soul of the modern world. This was the Cold War, not a war fought directly between two giants, but waged everywhere else, through influence, ideology, money, and fear. It was not a peace, it was a standoff. A world held in tension, suspended over a void. The globe became a chessboard, and every square mattered. When the Korean peninsula split in two, it became a proving ground for ideologies. The Korean War, the first hot conflict of the Cold War, left the peninsula divided to this day. In Vietnam, the U.S. fought not just a war against communists, but against the tide of national liberation, a war it could never truly win. Millions died, forests burned, and at home, American society began to fracture. In Latin America, democratically elected leaders were toppled if they veered too far left. The CIA backed coups, armed militias, and trained death squads, all in the name of anti-communism. Chile, Guatemala, Nicaragua, El Salvador. The pattern repeated. Stability was sacrificed for control. Africa, newly emerging from colonial rule, found itself caught in the same web. Proxy wars erupted as the U.S. and USSR armed rival factions. Civil wars were inflamed, coups encouraged, alliances bought. The goal was never peace. It was alignment. Even the Middle East, already scarred by imperial partition, became a theater for Cold War maneuvering. Oil made the region indispensable. Ideology made it combustible. Everywhere, the Cold War meant conflict. But it was a conflict denied. Wars were undeclared, operations covert, deaths written off as collateral. The world didn't call them wars, but they looked and felt like war to those on the ground. Beneath it all, the greatest threat of all hung in the air like a sword: nuclear annihilation. The arms race between the U.S. and USSR turned the planet into a hostage. By the 1960s, both sides possessed enough nuclear weapons to destroy the world many times over. The doctrine of mutually assured destruction wasn't a deterrent born of wisdom. It was a balance born of terror. The Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962 brought humanity to the brink. For 13 days, the world held its breath as the U.S. and the Soviet Union stared each other down over Soviet missiles in Cuba. One wrong move could have ended everything. That we survived was not a triumph of strategy. It was a miracle of restraint. The Cold War shaped every corner of the second half of the 20th century. It dictated foreign policy, justified authoritarian regimes, and fueled paranoia at home. It militarized the planet and turned culture into a weapon. Even space, the moon, the stars, became a frontier on this global contest. And yet, for all its noise and bloodshed, the Cold War was never officially declared. It had no start date and seemed to have no end. It was not a time of peace. It was a peace held at gunpoint. When the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, it seemed like the final chapter had been written. The red flag came down over the Kremlin. Communism, the great ideological rival of the West, had imploded under the weight of stagnation, bureaucracy, and internal dissent. In the West, there was a celebration, not just for the end of an adversary, but for what many believed was the end of history itself. The Cold War had framed the 20th century as a grand ideological contest. And now, there was only one system left standing: liberal democracy, global capitalism. American-style governance and Western economic models were declared the default future of the planet. It wasn't just victory, it was destiny. But victory can be deceptive. What looked like triumph was, in many ways, a rupture. The Soviet Union's collapse didn't bring global harmony. It brought a power vacuum. And in that vacuum, American power expanded, not just by intention, but by inertia. There was no more counterweight, no peer adversary. And so, American influence spread across every sphere: military, financial, technical, cultural. Globalization was heralded as the path to prosperity. Markets opened, borders blurred. Multinational corporations surged in power, and supply chains stretched across continents. But the rising tide of globalization didn't lift all boats. It outsourced labor, gutted industries, and widened inequality, both within nations and between them. In foreign policy, diplomacy gave way to intervention. Without a clear enemy, threats became fluid and abstract. Humanitarianism, terrorism, weapons of mass destruction, each became a justification for action and for the projection of force. Wars were no longer declared in Congress or Parliament. They were authorized quietly, continued indefinitely, and fought in the shadows. Airstrikes without declarations, drone wars without borders, occupation without end. In this new world order, the rules were rewritten, often by the winners. International law became selective. Regime change became a tool of policy. From the Balkans to Iraq, Afghanistan to Libya, the logic of global policing took hold. Even culture became a vehicle of dominance. Hollywood, Silicon Valley, Wall Street, these became the new instruments of soft power. English became the global language of commerce, technology, and diplomacy. And yet, the more the world was told it had won, the more resistance began to build. Because this new world was not stable. It was unipolar, but restless. The absence of a rival didn't produce peace. It produced imbalance. And imbalance breeds resentment. Russia, humiliated and diminished, began to turn inward and then backward. China, long patient, began to rise. Populist movements surged across Europe and the Americas, fueled by economic insecurity, cultural anxiety, and political alienation. The institutions meant to manage this new order, the United Nations, the World Bank, the World Trade Organization, began to lose credibility. The promises of a peaceful, liberal world faded into a reality of endless wars, financial crises, and growing disillusionment. History had not ended. It had just paused to catch its breath. The post-Cold War world was supposed to be a triumph, a new era of peace, prosperity, and integration. Instead, it became a proving ground for contradictions too deep to ignore. Globalization was sold as a path to shared wealth. Borders were blurred, economies would interlock, and people would rise together. But what emerged instead was a global order optimized not for fairness, but for capital. Factories moved offshore. Entire industries disappeared in the heartlands of the developed world. Free trade deals empowered corporations, but disempowered workers. Communities hollowed out. The promise of progress came with a price: precarity at home, instability abroad. Meanwhile, financialization took hold. Wealth shifted from production to speculation. Banks became more powerful than governments. Deregulation and complex financial instruments created bubbles. And when they burst, as in 2008, the damage was global. Millions lost homes, savings, jobs. But the architects of the collapse walked away with bonuses. The message was clear. The system served the few, not the many. Trust eroded. Institutions once seen as stewards, governments, media, financial regulators, were now viewed with suspicion, if not outright hostility. Democracy began to fray. Cynicism replaced civic faith. And into the void came something even more corrosive: permanent war. The attacks of September 11, 2001 gave the American empire its next mission. Terrorism became the new amorphous enemy, defined less by geography than by ideology. And so began the War on Terror, an open-ended, borderless campaign that reshaped the world. Afghanistan, Iraq, later Libya, Syria, Somalia, Yemen. The targets multiplied, but the objectives blurred. Wars weren't won, they were prolonged. Victory was redefined as degrading capability or maintaining presence. And while the bodies piled up overseas, the war followed us home. Surveillance expanded at an unprecedented scale. New technologies allowed the government to track emails, phone calls, location data. What would have been unthinkable before 9/11 became normalized after it. The state grew more powerful, but less accountable. Meanwhile, drone warfare removed even the last semblance of transparency. Strikes were launched from thousands of miles away. No trial, no warning, no oversight. Innocents died, families were erased. And with each death, another grievance was born. The consequences spilled across borders. Entire regions destabilized. Millions displaced by war and climate collapse sought refuge, only to be turned away, locked up, or left to drown. Refugee crises grew into political crises. Nativism surged, walls went up, and empathy went down. At home, veterans returned to broken health systems while defense contractors grew rich. Abroad, those promised democracy saw only occupation. Trust, once lost, curdled into fury. The cycle of violence persisted, only now without clarity or end. Wars with no declarations, enemies with no uniforms, allies with no credibility. And through it all, the empire strained to maintain control, not through inspiration, but through inertia. The cost was mounting, not just in blood or treasure, but in legitimacy. The age of unquestioned dominance was cracking, and the world could feel it. The West may have declared the Cold War over, but history did not end. It simply moved off stage. The world's other great civilizations hadn't vanished. They had been watching, waiting, rebuilding. Russia, stripped of its empire and its ideology, was left humiliated and broken. Its economy in freefall, its military in disrepair. Western advisors flooded in and oligarchs carved up the remains. But the Russian state, like its people, retained memory and resentment. Resentment at the chaos of the 1990s, at the NATO expansion that crept ever closer to its borders, at the sense that the West had not only won, it had gloated. Under Vladimir Putin, Russia began to reassert itself, first by consolidating power at home, then by projecting strength abroad. In Georgia, in Crimea, in Syria. Russia couldn't match the West economically, but it didn't have to. It could disrupt, undermine, play the spoiler. The old bear had stirred. China, meanwhile, took a longer view. It had spent centuries as the center of the world, until the century of humiliation at the hands of Western and Japanese imperial powers. But that memory, too, endured. Unlike Russia, China didn't rise through defiance. It rose through integration. It joined the global economy, opened its markets, and welcomed foreign investment. But it never surrendered sovereignty. Instead, it used the tools of globalization to its advantage. Factories became superpowers. Trade surpluses turned into political leverage. While the West outsourced its production, China built infrastructure, stockpiled resources, and mapped a path forward. By the 2010s, China was no longer just the world's workshop. It had become a geopolitical rival, economically, technologically, militarily. Its Belt and Road Initiative stretched across Asia, Africa, and Europe, reviving old trade routes and forging new alliances. It challenged the dollar. It built alternative institutions. It rejected the idea that Western liberalism was the inevitable future. The European Union, for its part, struggled with its own contradictions. It was conceived as a project for peace, to bind the former enemies into a common destiny. But integration came with tension. The euro unified economies but exposed inequality. Immigration tested the limits of solidarity. Populism rose in Hungary, Poland, Italy, even France. The United Kingdom voted to leave altogether. Europe, still a major power bloc, now found itself internally divided and externally hesitant. A giant unsure of its own voice. Meanwhile, the global south began to shift. In Latin America, in Africa, in South and Southeast Asia, new powers emerged. India, Brazil, Nigeria, Indonesia, vast populations, growing economies, rising aspirations. They no longer accepted a world order where decisions were made in Washington, Brussels, or Beijing alone. They wanted seats at the table, not as charity, but as right. The illusion of Western dominance began to crack, not because the West was suddenly weak, but because the rest of the world had grown stronger, more confident, less willing to follow. The tools of control, economic pressure, military superiority, cultural prestige, no longer held the same sway. Alternatives were emerging. The world was no longer unipolar. It wasn't even bipolar. It was fragmented, shifting, unstable, a landscape in motion. What had seemed in 1991 like a final chapter was just another turning point. The empire hadn't won. It had merely bought time. And that time was running out. The wars of the 21st century don't always look like wars. There are no formal declarations, no front lines carved into maps, no parade of tanks through conquered capitals. But the conflict continues, just beneath the surface, and sometimes in plain sight. Today's wars are economic. They're fought with sanctions instead of bullets, crushing currencies, isolating markets, weaponizing debt. A trade agreement can bring a country to heel. A supply chain disruption can freeze an industry. A targeted embargo can collapse an entire economy without a shot being fired. They're digital. Bits and bytes have replaced boots on the ground. Cyber attacks cripple infrastructure, steal state secrets, manipulate public opinion. Hospitals go dark, pipelines shut down, elections are hacked. No planes fly overhead, no bombs explode. But the damage is real, and the intent is unmistakable. They're psychological. Disinformation spreads faster than truth. Fake news, deepfakes, and algorithmic manipulation blur the lines between reality and propaganda. Foreign actors amplify domestic divisions, not by creating new ones, but by weaponizing the old. Trust collapses. People turn inward. And a society that no longer believes in itself becomes easy to destabilize from without. They're ecological. Climate change has become both a threat multiplier and a battlefield in its own right. Rising seas swallow homes, droughts wipe out crops, wildfires displace millions. Nations compete for water, food, arable land, and eventually for survival. Migration surges, borders harden, resources dwindle, and with each new disaster, a fragile system of global order strains further. Pandemics reveal the same fault lines. The COVID-19 crisis showed how quickly nations retreat into themselves, hoarding vaccines, closing borders, blaming others. Global cooperation fractured. And opportunists, both foreign and domestic, exploited the chaos. Elections became terrain, not through tanks or coups, but through bots, leaks, and influence operations. The goal isn't always to elect a preferred candidate. Sometimes it's simply to erode faith in the process itself, to make democracy look as broken as the alternatives. And yet, for all these transformations, the underlying war remains unchanged. It is a struggle over power, identity, legitimacy, and control. It is still driven by empire, old and aspiring, by ideology, explicit or hidden, by the ancient human impulse to dominate, to reshape the world in one's own image. Beneath it all lies the detritus of the last 100 years. Broken treaties, unhealed colonial wounds, ideological scars from wars never fully resolved. The same names echo through history: Berlin, Baghdad, Beijing, Crimea, Gaza. Different moments, same patterns. The truth is this: we never finished the first war. We just changed the rules, changed the weapons, changed the battlefield. But the war, the real war, never stopped. We often look back on the past century as a series of separate chapters: World War I, World War II, the Cold War, the War on Terror. But the boundaries between them are artificial. What if they're not separate stories at all, but acts in a single, sprawling drama? One where empire never truly died, where peace was never truly made, where victors never stopped fighting and the vanquished never truly surrendered. We call it modernity. But maybe it's just a more sophisticated form of chaos. Not the absence of war, but its evolution. From trench to drone, from blitzkrieg to blackout, from battlefield to balance sheet. For over a century, humanity has been locked in a recursive cycle of ambition, of fear, of power pursued and peace deferred. The uniforms have changed, the flags, the languages, the justifications. But the war, the real war, the struggle over who owns the future and who pays for the past, never really ended. It just went underground, online, on message. And now, as the world drifts once again toward confrontation, in Europe, in the Pacific, at home and abroad, the question isn't whether another great war is coming. The question is, did it ever stop?